Picture an autumn morning in the 13th century. A village lies beneath a veil of mist, the smell of damp earth mingling with smoke rising from thatched huts. Men and women with calloused hands and weathered faces are already out in the fields before the sun has even broken the horizon. These are serfs, bound for life to the soil of their lord. No one asks if they wish it so. From the moment of their birth, their fate is sealed. They belong to the land, and the land belongs to someone else. To us today, it may seem unbelievable that their average life expectancy rarely exceeded 35 years. In truth, reaching 30 was considered old, and many never lived long enough to see their children grow. A lifetime passed quickly, drained of strength, ending quietly, without headstones or legacy. But what forces conspired to cut their lives so short? From the very beginning, death shadowed their every step. Infants were frail, malnourished, and many died before leaving the cradle. Those who survived childhood grew up in poverty, forced into hard labor at an early age. Each day was a battle against hunger, cold, and illness. There was no space for dreams, no room for choices. Their lives were not only limited by the harshness of nature, but also by the chains of feudal law. A serf could not leave the land, nor seek a better life elsewhere. They were not simply workers, they were living property of the Lord, passed down through generations as though they were part of the estate itself. This bondage turned them into birds, whose wings had been clipped before they could ever take flight. Behind their stooped figures and relentless toil lay simple desires: to eat their fill, to see harvests succeed, to endure the winter without losing loved ones. Yet such hopes were seldom fulfilled. Famine, war, and disease stalked them constantly, silent enemies that claimed lives without mercy. What made it all the more bitter was their awareness of life's brevity. By the age of 20, many already thought of death. By 30, they looked back on a lifetime of toil. Time seemed to run faster because the end always came too soon. And as one generation replaced another, few ever dreamed of old age. Yet even in the shadows, sparks of resilience glimmered. The rare village feast days, the folk songs passed from elders to children, bore witness to their endurance. Though they knew their lives would be short, they still sowed and reaped, still bore children, still loved and held on to fleeting joys. Perhaps that is why history still echoes with their footsteps, those nameless millions who built the very foundations of medieval Europe. And now, let us look deeper into the invisible chains that bound them to understand why their lives so often ended before they had truly begun. To understand why serfs rarely lived past the age of 35, we must first grasp the system that ensnared them. Feudalism was not just a political order, it was a cage. At its heart stood the great lords, knights, and clergy, towering like immovable walls, while at the very bottom crouched the serfs, crushed by obligations they could never escape. To be born a serf was to inherit a life already decided, a contract sealed before one's first breath. Serfs were not slaves in the strictest sense, yet they were not free. They could not leave the land on which they were born, for they legally belonged to it. If the land was sold, they were sold with it. If the lord demanded labor, they were obliged to provide it. They worked their own small strips of field, but only after fulfilling endless duties on the lord's estate. Every harvest was shadowed by the knowledge that a portion of their meager yield was owed in taxes, rents, and dues. Grain, poultry, firewood, even hours of their very lives. Marriage itself was not theirs to decide. A serf wishing to wed outside his manor needed permission, often with a fee attached. Families were tethered to the soil, generation after generation, each child inheriting the same bondage as their parents. There was no path upward, no ladder to climb. It was a cycle carved into the very structure of medieval society, a loop designed to keep serfs in their place. Religion, which should have offered comfort, too often reinforced the chains. The church preached obedience, insisting that serfs should accept their lot as God's will. Priests reminded them that earthly suffering was the price for heavenly salvation. For a people with little hope of changing their worldly fate, such words were both a consolation and a cruel justification for their misery. The legal system only deepened the trap. A serf had no right to bring claims against his lord. In disputes, the lord's word was law, and punishment could be swift and brutal. Fines, beatings, or even expulsion from the land, a sentence that often meant slow starvation, were constant threats hanging over their heads. Fear became a way of life, carved as deeply into their hearts as the furrows they plowed into the soil. To the outside eye, a serf's village might have seemed peaceful, fields of wheat swaying in the wind, the manor looming in the distance. But beneath that veneer was a system of relentless extraction. Every hour of labor, every scrap of food, every life itself was drawn upward, feeding the wealth of lords and kings. The serf's body became the fuel that kept the machinery of feudal power grinding forward. And so it was not only hunger and disease that shortened the lives of serfs. It was the weight of a system designed to leave them with nothing. The chains of feudalism did not simply bind their wrists, they crushed their spirits, bent their backs, and wore their lives down to ash before they ever had a chance to bloom. The next piece of their suffering lay not only in law and duty, but in the empty bowls of their tables. For what good is labor without sustenance? What worth is survival when the stomach is never full? To see the true face of famine, we must step inside the cottages of the poor and watch as hunger becomes their most faithful companion. Step inside a peasant's hut on a cold winter's night, and you will find hunger sitting at the table like a permanent guest. The walls are thin, patched with mud and straw. The hearth smolders weakly, barely enough to warm the room. A family crouches around a wooden bowl, sharing a meal so plain it is almost air itself. A crust of coarse black bread, a ladle of barley gruel, perhaps a few turnips or cabbage leaves. Meat is a luxury, something tasted only on holy feast days, if at all. For the vast majority of the year, their stomachs knew little more than rough bread and thin pottage. Nutrition was not merely scarce, it was dangerously imbalanced. A diet built almost entirely on bread and grain left bodies weak, brittle, and vulnerable to disease. Children often grew up stunted, their bones bent under malnutrition, their teeth rotted early. Women, forced to endure both backbreaking labor and repeated childbirth, wasted away young. The few who lived beyond 30 carried bodies already ravaged by hunger and exhaustion. The great irony was that these same serfs worked the very land that produced abundance, but the best of it was never theirs. Grain, livestock, and dairy were demanded as rents and tithes, flowing upward into the manors of the lords and the coffers of the church. What remained for the serfs was the lowest quality: coarse flour filled with husks, milk watered down, scraps unfit for noble tables. Their labor fed the realm, but their own bellies were seldom satisfied. And then there were the famines. A poor harvest could turn life into catastrophe overnight. Drought, flood, or a sudden frost could erase the year's food, plunging entire villages into despair. In such years, serfs chewed on bark, boiled nettles, or gnawed at their seed grain, the very future they were supposed to plant. Starvation was not an anomaly. It was a rhythm, recurring every few decades, leaving behind fields of unburied dead and children with hollow eyes. Malnutrition weakened the body's defenses. Even minor illnesses, a cough, a fever, an infected cut, could become death sentences. The hunger that gnawed constantly at their bellies made them easy prey for epidemics. When the great plagues swept across Europe, serfs perished in staggering numbers not only because of disease, but because their bodies had long been prepared for death by famine. Meanwhile, across the hill, the Lord's manor glittered with abundance. Roasted meats, spiced wines, and gilded feasts mocked the emptiness of the serfs' bowls. That contrast was not lost on them. Hunger did not only sap their strength, it also deepened their bitterness. They labored, they sweated, they bled, yet they starved, while others feasted on the fruits of their toil. For a serf, hunger was more than a condition. It was a way of life. It taught them to endure quietly, to harden their children early, to swallow not just bread, but injustice. And in the end, it became one of the sharpest scythes cutting their lives short, long before the natural course of age could do so. But hunger was only half the burden. The other half was carved into their muscles, their bones, and their very breath, the endless grind of labor. For even on an empty stomach, the fields did not wait. And so, from dawn to dusk, the serf's body was spent like coin, until nothing remained. The life of a serf was measured not in years, but in seasons of labor. When the sun rose, so did they. Before the rooster's crow had finished echoing across the fields, they were already bent over their work. Men hacked at the stubborn soil with heavy wooden plows, often pulled not by horses, too costly, but by themselves or oxen. Women trudged alongside, scattering seed or gathering weeds, infants swaddled and strapped to their backs. Children, scarcely old enough to walk steadily, were sent to chase birds from the fields or fetch water from the stream. From the first breath of life until the last, work consumed them. The serf's calendar was relentless. Spring brought plowing and sowing. Summer, the constant battle against weeds. Autumn, the harvest. Every hand summoned, every body needed. Winter might have seemed a respite, but even then there was wood to cut, repairs to make, and the Lord's stores to fill. There was no true rest, only a shift in the shape of labor. Even on Sundays, when the church demanded worship, the serf often found himself caught between the salvation of his soul and the survival of his family. And this toil was not only for their own survival. A large portion of their effort went directly to the Lord's domain. The manor lands worked not for their families, but for their master. Days of corvée labor were demanded, sometimes at the height of harvest when their own crops cried out for attention. To refuse was unthinkable. Punishment could be swift and merciless. So they bent their backs twice over, feeding another's storehouse before filling their own. The physical toll was brutal. Serfs bore bodies shaped by hardship, crooked spines, twisted joints, hands split and scarred. Few ever escaped injury. A fall from a cart, a slip of the sickle, a kick from an ox. All could cripple, and there was no healer waiting with gentle care. To be injured was to be cast aside, a burden to the family, a mouth with no hands to feed it. Many simply worked through the pain until their bodies collapsed. Exhaustion itself was a silent killer. Without proper food, the long hours of strain drained their strength day by day. It was not uncommon for men to fall dead in the field, their hearts giving out before their time. Women fared little better, expected to work through pregnancy and return to the fields days after childbirth. The land consumed them without pause, caring little for the frailty of flesh. Yet perhaps the cruelest truth was that all this labor rarely lifted them above subsistence. No matter how many hours they poured into the soil, hunger and poverty remained constant companions. The more they gave, the more was taken. Their sweat watered the crops, their blood fertilized the earth, and yet their reward was only survival, until even that failed. Still, they endured. Not because they had a choice, but because life itself demanded it. The fields did not care for tired bones, nor did the Lord grant mercy for aching limbs. To be a serf was to live within an endless cycle, to sow, to reap, to toil, and to die before time. But even endless labor was not the deadliest foe they faced, for lurking beyond the horizon were enemies far more merciless, the plagues and pestilences that swept through villages like storms, killing in days what hunger and toil had taken years to wear down. If hunger gnawed at the serf's belly and labor broke his body, disease stalked him like a shadow he could never escape. Illness in the Middle Ages was not a passing misfortune. It was a death sentence whispered on the wind, a constant reminder that life was fragile and fleeting. In villages of mud and smoke, where livestock shared space with families and water sources ran foul, invisible killers thrived. Common fevers swept through cottages with ease. Dysentery, born of contaminated water, could empty a village of children in a single season. Tuberculosis lingered in the lungs, turning breath into agony. Pneumonia claimed the weak during harsh winters, when cold air seeped through broken thatch roofs. Even something as minor as a cut from a sickle or a splinter in the foot could fester, swelling into infection without any remedy but prayer. But the true terrors came in waves, epidemics that rolled across the countryside like storms. Typhoid, ergot poisoning from tainted rye, and influenza tore through communities unprepared to fight them. Then came the Black Death in the 14th century, a horror so profound it reshaped Europe itself. Whole families died within days, bodies piled on carts, villages silenced in eerie stillness. Serfs, already weakened by hunger and toil, were the easiest prey. The conditions of their lives fed these plagues. They lived crammed together in smoky, poorly ventilated huts, often alongside pigs, chickens, or goats. Waste and refuse filled the ditches. Clean water was a dream. Vermin crawled freely across straw beds, fleas and lice spreading contagion faster than rumor. Each cough, each sneeze, carried with it the possibility of a family's undoing. There were no doctors for the serfs, no remedies beyond what herbs the wise women could gather, or what blessings the priest could intone. A poultice of garlic, a charm against the evil eye, or the draining of blood with a rusty knife. These were the desperate weapons against foes unseen. Often the cure killed as swiftly as the disease. Mothers whispered prayers as infants burned with fever. Fathers buried children before they had learned to walk. Worse still, illness carried not only suffering, but stigma. A diseased man was often shunned, his family left to fend for themselves. Villages sometimes abandoned the sick entirely, locking doors against neighbors who once shared their bread. Fear made enemies of friends, as no one knew whose house would be next to echo with coughing and cries. Death was swift, yet cruelly familiar. To be a serf was to watch siblings, parents, children slip away in a constant rhythm of grief. The bell of the parish church tolled endlessly, not in rare mourning, but as part of daily life. And when death struck in numbers too great, the bodies were cast into pits. No prayers, no candles, just earth swallowing the forgotten. This ceaseless tide of disease did more than shorten lives. It stripped away hope. When even the young, the strong, and the faithful could be taken in days, what meaning could there be in toil? Yet somehow the serfs endured, carrying their sorrow in silence, pressing forward because the soil demanded it. For them, survival was never guaranteed. It was borrowed time, fragile as the flame of a single candle flickering against the wind. But even in the face of disease, there was another realm of suffering that deepened their despair. The dark, stumbling world of medieval medicine, where ignorance wore the mask of knowledge and hope was often deadlier than illness itself. For the serf, falling ill was not simply a matter of endurance. It was a gamble with fate in a world where medicine was cloaked in superstition and ignorance. Healing, as they knew it, was a patchwork of tradition, faith, and desperation. And more often than not, the cure was as dangerous as the disease itself. When sickness struck, the first recourse was the village wise woman, or herbalist. She might offer a tea brewed from nettles, a poultice of garlic, or a charm whispered beneath her breath. Some of these remedies carried merit. Plants like yarrow and willow bark held properties that truly eased pain or fever. Yet these practices existed in a fog of half-knowledge, passed down by word of mouth, mingling useful wisdom with dangerous folklore. The church, ever vigilant, watched these figures closely. Healing was to be guided by prayer, relics, and ritual, not by pagan herbs and charms. To lean too heavily on folk remedies risked accusations of witchcraft, a fate that could lead not to recovery, but to the stake. Thus, serfs walked a fine line between hope and fear, torn between tradition and the church's authority. When ailments worsened, the local priest became the healer. He might bless holy water, anoint the sick with oil, or prescribe pilgrimages to shrines where miracles were said to dwell. At times, sacred relics, a saint's bone, a vial of holy dust, were believed to drive illness away. But such cures treated the soul, not the body, leaving the serf weakened and vulnerable still. Then there were the learned physicians, though serfs rarely saw them. Their treatments were steeped in the ancient teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through centuries of misunderstanding. Disease was thought to be the result of imbalanced humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and so they prescribed purges, vomits, and most notoriously, bloodletting. With crude knives and leeches, they drained the life from their patients in hopes of restoring balance, often hastening death instead. For women, the dangers were especially grim. Childbirth was a battlefield of its own, fought without antiseptics, anesthesia, or skilled midwives in many villages. The toll was devastating. Countless mothers perished in labor, leaving infants motherless and husbands broken. Infants, too, faced staggering odds. Half of all children did not survive past their 5th year, their lives extinguished before they had even begun to toil in the fields. Ignorance compounded suffering. Mental illness was seen as demonic possession, epilepsy as the devil's grip. Treatments ranged from exorcisms to confinement, sometimes even chaining the afflicted to church walls. To be sick in body or mind was to risk not just pain but suspicion, shame, and isolation. And yet, within this darkness, a strange resilience endured. Communities still clung to their healers, to their prayers, to the slim chance that nature or faith might intervene. Death was constant, but so too was the determination to fight it, however futile the weapons. For the serf, medicine was rarely salvation. It was another reflection of the powerlessness that defined their lives. Disease struck, remedies failed, and life ended swiftly. But if illness and poor care haunted the body, there was yet another scourge that tore through their villages with steel and fire, the endless shadow of war. If hunger and disease devoured serfs from within, war consumed them from without. Medieval Europe was a land scarred by ceaseless conflict, lords feuding with neighbors, kings clashing for crowns, invaders sweeping through villages like storms. For the noble elite, war was a matter of glory, honor, and territory. For the serf, it was devastation. The battlefield was never far from the plow. Armies marched across farmland, trampling fields, seizing livestock, burning cottages to ash. Villages that had labored months for a harvest saw it stolen in an afternoon by men-at-arms, who cared nothing for the hunger left behind. Serfs, powerless to resist, watched their families scatter into the woods while soldiers raided their stores. For them, every trumpet call and clash of banners spelled another season of misery. And when lords demanded soldiers, serfs were often called upon. Though rarely trained as knights, many were forced into levies, armed with crude spears or farm tools, sent to fight battles they did not understand. They stood in muddy lines, shieldless, against armored foes, their lives little more than fodder for their masters' ambitions. Few returned, and those who did carried scars that never healed, wounds to body and spirit alike. Even those who stayed behind were not spared. Marauders roamed the countryside, deserters pillaging without restraint. Women and children bore the brunt of this violence, their suffering unspoken, their lives shattered by atrocities committed in war's shadow. To survive, many hid in forests or caves, abandoning homes built by generations, reduced to fugitives in their own land. And war did not only strike with swords, it brought famine in its wake, as fields lay untended and livestock slaughtered. Disease followed, spreading swiftly among starving refugees huddled together in filth. In this way, war fed hunger, and hunger fed plague, a vicious circle in which the serf was forever caught. For nobles, war might bring plunder, ransom, or new titles. For the church, it brought tithes and influence, but for serfs, it brought only graves. A father slain on the battlefield left his family destitute. A burned village erased generations of labor in a single night. And a community bled dry by endless campaigns had no chance to recover before the next army came marching. To live as a serf was to live under constant threat that tomorrow your world might vanish in smoke. Each sunrise might be greeted by peace, or by the sight of armored riders cresting the hill. No fortress protected them, no law shielded them. They were the expendable foundation on which kings built empires, and like mortar, they were expected to be spent, replaced, and forgotten. But amidst all this, there was one group who bore a double burden, who faced not only the cruelties of war, hunger, and disease, but the dangers of their own bodies and society's expectations. The women of the medieval village. Their struggle tells another chapter in the story of lives cut short. If life was cruel to the serf, it was often crueler still to the serf woman. She bore not only the backbreaking work of the fields, but also the unrelenting demands of childbirth, motherhood, and servitude. Her body was both a tool of labor and a vessel of survival for the village. Yet it was seldom granted rest, dignity, or safety. At dawn, she rose alongside her husband, trudging to the fields with a hoe in her hands and a child strapped to her back. Her labor was no lighter than a man's. She sowed, weeded, and harvested under the same burning sun, all while tending to infants and elders alike. When she returned home, her work only continued. She cooked coarse meals, fetched water from distant wells, mended clothing worn thin, and cared for livestock penned beside the cottage. Her hours stretched endlessly, her body worn thin by the double yoke of survival and expectation. And then came childbirth, the most dangerous trial of her short life. With no doctors, no knowledge of hygiene, and little more than the aid of other village women, labor could turn fatal in an instant. Hemorrhage, infection, or exhaustion claimed countless lives. To give birth was to walk with death at one's side, and too often the mother did not return. It is no wonder that many villages buried women in their 20s, leaving behind infants who rarely lived long without them. Those who survived childbirth faced the endless cycle of pregnancy. A serf woman bore child after child, as many as her body could endure, because each new life meant another set of hands for the fields, or, at the very least, the hope that one or two would outlive the brutal odds. Yet every pregnancy weakened her, drained her strength, and shortened the years she might otherwise have known. Her suffering was not only physical. The feudal system regarded her as an extension of property, her marriage subject to her lord's approval, her body vulnerable to exploitation. In times of war, invading soldiers often treated women as spoils, inflicting violence that silenced generations. The weight of shame and silence compounded wounds that no herb or prayer could heal. And yet, despite this crushing burden, serf women carried the village on their shoulders. They preserved folk songs, kept traditions alive, and taught children to endure hardship with quiet resilience. Their laughter at feast days, their voices rising in lullabies over smoky cradles, were the fragile threads that bound the community together in the face of despair. Still, their lives remained heartbreakingly short. Few reached old age, most faded in their 30s, victims of exhaustion, childbirth, or disease. In the silence of churchyards, the graves of young mothers outnumbered all others, a grim testament to the cost of survival. Through their labor, their pain, and their sacrifice, women shaped the very heartbeat of medieval life. But their stories, like those of their husbands and children, were rarely written in chronicles. They endured, they died, and history moved on, leaving only echoes of their struggles. Yet not all serfs accepted their fate in silence. When hunger sharpened, when taxes crushed, and when despair turned to fury, there were moments when villages rose against their masters, voices shouting in defiance of centuries of chains. Their rebellions, though often doomed, lit sparks of resistance that history has not fully forgotten. Though the life of the serf was weighed down by chains of hunger, disease, war, and endless toil, there were moments, brief, fragile, and dangerous, when despair turned to defiance. Hope flickered in their hearts like a candle against the wind, and when oppression pressed too heavily, that flame could ignite rebellion. The roots of revolt grew quietly, in whispers shared by firelight after a day's labor. A new tax imposed, a tithe demanded by the church, a lord's cruelty stretched too far. These injustices festered in the silence of the fields. And though most serfs endured with bowed heads, some began to murmur, "Why must it be so? Why should we starve while others feast?" Those murmurs, multiplied, became the seeds of uprising. History remembers certain great peasant revolts. In 1381, English serfs rose in fury, demanding freedom from bondage, fair rents, and justice from their rulers. They marched to London, their voices carried on the summer wind, shocking the realm that had long dismissed them as voiceless. Though their rebellion was crushed, the cry of the serf had been heard, and it echoed long after the swords were sheathed. Elsewhere across Europe, villages refused to pay dues, barricaded their lands, or fled en masse to towns where freedom could sometimes be claimed. Though many of these acts ended in blood, they revealed a truth lords feared. Even the lowliest could resist. And resistance, however brief, chipped away at the unshakable facade of feudal power. Yet rebellion was not only found in fire and steel. Hope lived in other forms too, in the laughter of feast days, in music and dance that defied hunger, in tales told by hearths that promised a better life beyond toil. For a moment, serfs became more than shadows bending over the soil. They became human in joy, as well as in suffering. Festivals, though few, were lifelines. Days when bread was shared more freely, when song rose above sorrow, when the community remembered itself not as prisoners, but as people. Faith also provided a measure of hope, even if the church often reinforced their chains. Pilgrimages offered a chance, however slim, to leave their villages and see the wider world. Relics and shrines gave them the belief that miracles might still intervene, that God had not abandoned the poor. In faith, they found strength to endure, even when the world gave them none. But hope came at a cost. Rebellion was met with merciless reprisal. Lords sent soldiers to slaughter villages, burn homes, and hang leaders from gibbets as warnings. Dreams of freedom were buried in shallow graves, yet seeds of resistance lingered in the soil, waiting for the right season to rise again. In this way, serfs lived lives of contradiction, chained and voiceless, yet capable of fierce defiance, ground into dust, yet still clinging to song and faith. Their rebellions did not often win freedom, but they left behind a legacy of courage, the reminder that even those born to die young could still demand more from the world. And so we arrive at the final question. What legacy did these short, brutal lives leave behind? If serfs rarely lived past 35, what do their struggles tell us about the medieval world and about ourselves today? The story of the serfs is not one of individual triumphs, but of collective endurance. They were the countless hands that built the fields, the churches, and the castles of medieval Europe. Though they rarely lived past 35, their short lives shaped centuries, laying the foundations of a society that would one day outgrow the chains that bound them. Their suffering was the price of stability for the kingdoms and lords who ruled over them. Serfs fed armies, tilled the land, and filled the coffers of manor and monastery alike. Without their labor, the glittering courts of kings and the soaring cathedrals of Christendom could never have existed. Yet history seldom remembers their names. They were the silent multitudes, forgotten in chronicles that celebrated knights and nobles, but overlooked the plowmen who gave them bread. Still, their lives carry lessons for us. The brevity of their existence reminds us how fragile survival once was, how hunger, disease, and injustice could extinguish life before it had barely begun. To live past 35 was not ordinary. It was a victory over forces that seemed insurmountable. In their struggle, we see the raw truth of human endurance, that even in the harshest conditions, people can love, hope, and create meaning. Their rebellions, though often crushed, foreshadowed the gradual decline of serfdom. Each uprising, each refusal to yield, carved cracks in the walls of feudal power. Over centuries, those cracks widened, giving rise to towns, trade, and a new middle class. The serfs who demanded freedom planted the seeds of change, even if they themselves did not live to see it bloom. We also see in their plight the cost of inequality. The gulf between lord and serf was not only measured in wealth, but in years of life. While nobles dined on meat and wine into their 40s or 50s, the serf withered away in his 30s. The system itself devoured lives, reminding us that privilege and oppression can shape not only opportunity, but the very span of human existence. Today, in an age of modern medicine, plentiful food, and rights enshrined in law, it is easy to forget how far we have come. But the echo of the serf's struggle still warns us. Justice, health, and dignity are fragile things, won not by inevitability, but by centuries of toil and sacrifice. Their brief lives whisper across the ages, urging us not to squander what they never had. If you were born a serf in the Middle Ages, Would you have survived to 35? Would you have endured the hunger, the sickness, the back-breaking labor, the weight of chains both visible and invisible? Most would not. And yet millions did endure, if only for a few decades, enough to raise children, to sing songs, to keep alive a spark of humanity in a world determined to snuff it out. In the end, the serfs' legacy is not written in chronicles of kings, but in the soil they tilled, the villages they built, and the resilience they embodied. Their lives were short, brutal, and often forgotten, yet they are the unseen pillars upon which history still rests. Their story is a reminder that even the humblest lives matter, and that endurance itself can be a form of quiet triumph.